Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything we thought we knew about someone. Sometimes a single moment can remind us that every person has a story worth hearing. Officer Derek Langston was having a bad day when he got called about a homeless man causing trouble downtown. He found an old man sitting by a broken piano on the street. Derek was annoyed and told him to play something or leave. The old man sat down and began to play the most beautiful music Derek had ever heard. People stopped to listen. Cars slowed down. Something magical was happening. But Derek didn't know this homeless man was once a famous composer who had disappeared. Years ago, after losing everything, what could bring a man from the concert halls of the world to the streets? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Derek Langston rubbed his eyes and stared at the coffee maker in his small kitchen, watching the dark liquid drip into the glass pot with the same mechanical precision that had governed his life for the past 25 years. The apartment felt too quiet without Linda's morning routine. The soft padding of her slippers on the hardwood floor, the gentle hum she made while applying her makeup, the way she'd always kiss his cheek before leaving for work. 6 months since the divorce papers were signed, and he still caught himself listening for sounds that would never come again. The badge felt heavier than usual as he pinned it to his uniform shirt. His father's badge had felt the same way, he remembered, like carrying the weight of every promise made to serve and protect. Captain Robert Langston had worn his badge for 32 years before a heart attack took him at his desk, still reviewing case files at midnight. Derek often wondered if his father had felt this same bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to seep into everything these days. At the Phoenix Police Department's Central Division, the morning briefing carried the usual litany of complaints, domestic disturbances, and petty crimes that defined urban policing. Detective Maria Santos caught his eye as they filed out of the briefing room. "You look like hell, Derek," she said, with the bluntness that came from 15 years of partnership. "Thanks for the pep talk," Derek replied, managing a tired smile. "Just another beautiful day in paradise. When's the last time you took a vacation? Real vacation, not just sitting in that empty apartment of yours?" Derek shrugged. The truth was, he couldn't remember the last time he'd wanted to go anywhere. Work filled the hours between sleep, and sleep was often elusive anyway. "Maybe after I figure out what I'm supposed to do with the rest of my life." The radio crackled to life as they walked to their patrol cars. "Unit 47, we have multiple complaints about a disturbance near 5th and Madison. Homeless individual reportedly harassing pedestrians near the old Morrison music store." Derek sighed and reached for his radio. "Unit 47 responding." Another homeless complaint. The city seemed to generate them like rain, each one blending into the next in an endless cycle of mental illness, addiction, and society's inability to know what to do with people who fell through the cracks. Across town, Emil Novak sat on a piece of cardboard behind a dumpster, carefully rationing the half sandwich he'd managed to salvage from a cafe's trash bin. The bread was only slightly stale, and the turkey still tasted fresh enough. In another life, a life that felt like a dream now, he would have thrown away food better than this without a second thought. The morning shelter routine had become as mechanical as breathing. Wake at 5:30 when the lights came on. Fold his thin blanket. Wait in line for the bathroom. Accept the small cup of coffee and piece of toast they offered before sending everyone back to the streets. The volunteers meant well, but Emil could see the mixture of pity and discomfort in their eyes when they looked at him. He was the old man with the sun-weathered skin and the too thin frame, another casualty of whatever circumstances had brought him to their doors. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that those same hands that now trembled slightly from malnutrition had once commanded standing ovations at Carnegie Hall. That the mind now focused on finding safe places to sleep had once memorized complex compositions that took other musicians months to master. that the man they saw shuffling through their soup kitchen line had once worn tailored tuxedos and received flowers from admirers after every performance. Emile touched the wedding ring on his finger, a habit he'd never broken. Despite everything, the gold had worn thin over the years, but he couldn't bring himself to remove it. Sarah had slipped it onto his finger 38 years ago, and even now, even after everything that had happened, it felt like the only real thing left of who he used to be. The Morrison music store had been boarded up for 3 years, another victim of the neighborhood's slow decline. Emile remembered when it had been vibrant, full of children taking lessons and adults browsing sheet music. The owner, Harold Morrison, had been a kind man who'd sometimes let local musicians practice on the old upright piano in the back room. When Harold died and his children sold the building, the new owners had simply locked it up and walked away, waiting for the right development opportunity. Someone had left an old upright piano on the sidewalk beside the boarded-up store. Emile had discovered it 2 weeks ago, sitting abandoned, like so much else in this part of the city. The piano was in terrible condition, keys yellowed and some completely silent, the wood warped from exposure to weather, but it was still recognizably the instrument that had once been the center of his entire world. Emile had approached it cautiously. That first day, like someone might approach a sleeping animal they weren't sure was friendly. He'd touched one key, then another, surprised when they produced actual notes instead of the dead thuds he'd expected. The sound was thin and tinny, but it was music. Real music. Since then, he'd returned every day, sometimes just sitting beside the piano, sometimes running his fingers over the keys without pressing them. He hadn't actually played, not really played, in almost 15 years. The muscle memory was still there, buried under layers of grief and guilt and self-imposed exile, but the courage to unlock it remained elusive. The complaints had started almost immediately. Business owners worried about property values, pedestrians uncomfortable with his presence, the usual chorus of voices that arose whenever the invisible became visible, whenever society's failures took up space in the carefully maintained facade of urban normalcy. Derek pulled up to 5th and Madison, already forming his approach in his mind. Direct but not aggressive, firm but not cruel. Move the problem along without making it worse. It was a delicate balance he'd learned over 2.5 decades of dealing with people who had nowhere else to go. What he found challenged every assumption he'd carried into the situation. Instead of the ranting, possibly intoxicated individual he'd expected, he saw a man who looked like he belonged in a library or a doctor's office. Intelligent eyes, careful posture, an alertness that suggested mental clarity despite his obvious circumstances. The man was sitting quietly beside the piano, not bothering anyone, not appearing to be under the influence of anything stronger than exhaustion. His clothes were worn but clean, his grey hair neatly combed, despite having no permanent address. There was a dignity about him that made Derek pause before speaking. "Afternoon," Derek said, keeping his voice neutral. "I'm Officer Langston. I've gotten some calls about me," the man said quietly. His voice carried an accent Derek couldn't quite place, cultured and careful. "I understand. I can move along." But Derek found himself hesitating. There was something about this man that didn't fit the usual pattern. No aggressive posturing, no rambling complaints about injustice, no signs of mental illness or substance abuse, just quiet resignation mixed with an unmistakable sadness that seemed to radiate from him like heat from pavement. "What's your name?" Derek asked. "Emile," the man replied. "Emile Novak." Derek glanced at the piano. "You play?" Emile's eyes followed Derek's gaze, and for a moment something flickered across his face, longing, perhaps, or pain. "Once," he said simply. The word hung between them, loaded with implications Derek couldn't begin to understand. But something about the way Emile said it, the careful weight he gave to that single syllable, suggested depths that Derek found himself curious about despite his better judgment. Around them, The city continued its relentless pace. Cars honked in the distance, people hurried past on important errands. The afternoon sun beat down on the pavement, making everything shimmer with heat and possibility, and between a tired police officer and a homeless man with intelligent eyes, something was beginning that would change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. Derek's radio crackled again. "Unit 47. What's your status on the 5th and Madison call?" "Still on scene," Derek replied, his eyes not leaving Emil's face. There was something here, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. In 25 years of police work, he'd developed an instinct for reading people, and everything about Emil Novak contradicted the complaints he'd received. "Sir," Derek said, his tone softening slightly, "I need to ask, have you been bothering anyone? Asking for money? Being aggressive?" Emil shook his head slowly. "No, officer, I sit here quietly. Sometimes I look at the piano, I don't bother anyone." "Then why are people calling about you?" Emil's laugh was bitter but quiet. "People see what they expect to see. They see an old homeless man and they assume I'm dangerous, or drunk, or mentally ill." He paused. "Maybe they're not entirely wrong about the last one." Derek found himself studying Emil more carefully. The man's clothes were threadbare but clean. His fingernails were trimmed and surprisingly clean for someone living on the streets. There was an intelligence in his eyes that suggested education, refinement even. This wasn't the typical homeless complaint Derek was used to handling. "The piano," Derek said, nodding toward the abandoned instrument. "You said you used to play. What kind of music?" Something shifted in Emil's expression, a flash of pain, so quick Derek almost missed it. "Classical mostly, some jazz, some compositions of my own." His voice became even quieter. "A lifetime ago." Derek's radio buzzed again. "Unit 47, we have another call holding. Can you clear that scene?" Derek felt the familiar pressure of his job. Move along, handle the next crisis. Don't get too involved. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way Emil spoke about music, or maybe it was the careful way he avoided looking directly at the piano, like it might hurt him. "Look," Derek said, his frustration with the day boiling over into sarcasm. "People are complaining about you sitting here. You say you used to play piano, so either play something useful or move along. At least give them something worth calling about." The words came out harsher than Derek intended, fueled by his own exhaustion and the absurdity of having to police someone's right to exist in public space. But as soon as he said them, he saw something change in Emil's face. Emil looked at the piano for a long moment, then back at Derek. "You want me to play? I want you to either do something or go somewhere else. I've got real crimes to deal with." Emil stood slowly, as if his joints ached, and walked a few steps to the piano bench. He sat down carefully and placed his hands on the keyboard, fingers hovering just above the yellowed keys. Derek expected some fumbling, maybe a few choppy notes that would quickly prove Emil's claims were just the fantasies of a man trying to hold on to some dignity. Instead, Emil's fingers found the keys, with the precision of someone who had spent decades knowing exactly where each note lived. The first chord that emerged from the battered piano was clear and haunting, despite the instrument's obvious limitations. Derek recognized the melody immediately, though he couldn't name it. Something classical, something he'd heard in movies, or elevators, but never really listened to. But hearing it now, played by Emil's weathered hands on this broken piano in the middle of a deteriorating street, the music took on a quality Derek had never noticed before. Emil's eyes closed as he played, and Derek watched his entire posture change. The defeated slump disappeared, replaced by the straight-back dignity of a performer. His hands moved across the keys with a fluid grace that spoke of countless hours of practice, of muscle memory so deep it survived years of neglect. The piece was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, though Derek wouldn't learn that until much later. What he experienced in that moment was something he'd never felt before, the sensation of time stopping, of the chaotic noise of the city fading away, replaced by something pure and achingly beautiful. People began to stop. First, just one pedestrian, then another. A woman pushing a stroller paused on the sidewalk. A businessman checking his phone looked up and forgot whatever urgent message he'd been reading. Cars slowed as drivers tried to identify the source of the music drifting through their open windows. Derek felt something shift inside his chest, an emotion he couldn't name. The music was professional quality. Better than professional, it was. The kind of playing Derek had only heard in concert halls. The few times Linda had dragged him to cultural events he'd thought he was too practical to appreciate. But this was different. This wasn't just technical skill, though Emil clearly possessed that in abundance. This was music infused with something deeper, pain, maybe, or longing, or the accumulated weight of years spent carrying secrets too heavy to share. Emil's performance lasted perhaps 4 minutes, though Derek lost all sense of time while listening. When the final notes faded into the afternoon air, the silence that followed felt almost sacred. The small crowd that had gathered, maybe 15 people now, stood perfectly still, as if afraid to break whatever spell had been cast. Then the applause began. Hesitant at first, then building into something approaching a standing ovation. Derek looked around in amazement at the faces surrounding him. Office workers, shop owners, tourists, all united in their recognition that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Emil opened his eyes and looked down at his hands, still resting on the keyboard, as if surprised to find them there. He stood slowly and stepped away from the piano, that defeated posture returning like armor he couldn't quite shed. "That was," Derek began. But Emil was already walking away, moving with the quick shuffle of someone trying to become invisible. "Again!" "Wait," Derek called. But Emil didn't stop. He disappeared around the corner, leaving Derek standing beside the piano with a crowd of people still processing what they'd just heard. Derek's radio crackled again. "Unit 47, what's your status?" Derek stared at the piano, then at the corner where Emil had disappeared. "Scene is clear," he said automatically, though he felt anything but clear about what had just happened. As the crowd dispersed, Derek found himself examining the piano more closely. Wedged between 2 keys was a piece of paper, old, yellowed, with musical notation written in pencil. The paper was torn and weathered, but Derek could make out enough to see it was handwritten music, not printed sheet music from a store. At the top of the page, in faded pencil, were the words, "For Sarah, EN, 1987. Derek carefully extracted the paper and folded it, slipping it into his shirt pocket. Whatever had just happened, whoever Emil Novak really was, this wasn't over. The music still echoed in Derek's mind as he walked back to his patrol car, and he knew that the sound of it would haunt him until he found answers. For the first time in months, Derek felt something approaching curiosity about another human being. It was an unfamiliar feeling, like a muscle he'd forgotten he had suddenly coming back to life. Derek couldn't concentrate on his paperwork. The sound of Emil's playing kept drifting back to him, note by note, as if the music had taken up residence in his mind. He'd handled the rest of his shift on autopilot. A fender bender on 7th Street, a shoplifting call at the drugstore. The usual routine that normally provided enough distraction to keep him from thinking too much about anything, but not today. Today, every quiet moment was filled with the memory of those weathered hands moving across yellowed piano keys with impossible grace. Back at his apartment that evening, Derek found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He opened his laptop and began searching the internet. Emil Novak pianist yielded thousands of results, but most seemed to be for different people, younger musicians, students, local performers. He tried Emil Novak composer and found a few more promising leads. Then he tried Emil Novak Carnegie Hall and felt his breath catch. The first result was a digitized newspaper review from the New York Times, dated September 15th, 1987. The headline read, Young pianist delivers stunning Carnegie Hall debut. Below it was a photograph of a man Derek barely recognized. Younger, well-dressed, confident, but unmistakably Emile. Derek read the review twice, then a third time. Words like extraordinary, virtuosic, and destined for greatness appeared throughout. The critic wrote about Emile's profound emotional depth and technical mastery that belied his young age. The article mentioned that Emile was only 28, at the time making him 73 now, which matched the man Derek had met that afternoon. But if this was the same Emile Novak, what had happened? How did someone go from Carnegie Hall to sitting homeless beside a broken piano on a Phoenix Street? Derek kept searching, finding more reviews, more accolades. Emile Novak had been featured in major music magazines. He'd performed with symphony orchestras across Europe and North America. There were recordings available. Derek ordered 3 of them online without thinking about the cost. The search results became sparser after the mid-1990s, and by 2000, Emile Novak seemed to have simply vanished from the classical music world. No retirement announcements, no farewell tours, no interviews explaining his absence. He was simply there one day and gone the next. Derek printed out the most significant articles and reviews, creating a small pile of evidence that the homeless man he'd met was once one of the most promising classical pianists of his generation. The disconnect was staggering. The next morning, Derek found himself driving past 5th and Madison before his official shift began. The piano was still there, but Emile was nowhere to be seen. Derek parked and walked over to the instrument, running, his fingers over the keys the way Emile had done. The piano was even more damaged than he'd initially realized. Several keys were completely silent, others produced notes that were wildly out of tune. Yet somehow, Emile had managed to create something beautiful from this broken instrument. Derek's partner, Detective Santos, found him there 20 minutes later. "What are you doing here, Derek? Shift doesn't start for another hour." "Just following up on yesterday's call," Derek said, which was technically true, if incomplete. Maria studied his face. "You're acting weird. Weirder than usual, I mean." Derek showed her the printouts he'd brought with him. Maria read through the articles, her eyebrows rising higher with each page. "So, you're telling me the homeless guy from yesterday is some kind of famous musician, was famous 30 years ago, and now he's living on the streets?" Maria handed the papers back to Derek. "What happened to him? That's what I'm trying to figure out." Maria was quiet for a moment, studying Derek's face. "Be careful, partner. I know you're going through a rough patch with the divorce and everything, but don't get too invested in this guy's story. We see a lot of people who used to be something else. That doesn't mean we can fix them." Derek knew Maria was right, but he also knew he couldn't let this go. The image of Emile walking away after his performance, shoulders hunched in defeat, despite having just created something magnificent, had lodged itself in Derek's mind like a splinter. That afternoon, Derek returned to 5th and Madison during his lunch break. This time, Emile was there, sitting on his piece of cardboard, about 20 feet from the piano. He looked up when Derek approached, wariness flickering across his features. "Officer Langston," Emile said carefully. "More complaints?" "No complaints today." Derek sat down on the curb beside Emile, ignoring the surprised look this earned him. "I wanted to talk to you about yesterday, about your playing." Emile's expression became guarded. "What about it?" Derek pulled out one of the printed articles, the Carnegie Hall Review, and handed it to Emile. He watched as Emile's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, pain, something that might have been nostalgia, and finally, a deep sadness that seemed to settle into his bones. "Where did you find this?" Emile asked quietly. "Internet. Took me about 10 minutes. Derek paused. "Emile Novak, born in Prague, 1959. Studied at the Juilliard School. Carnegie Hall, debut at 28. Performed with the London Symphony, the Berlin Philharmonic, the New York Philharmonic." Derek recited the facts like a police report. Recording contracts with major labels, international tours. Critics calling you one of the most promising pianists of your generation. Emil folded the article carefully and handed it back to Derek. That was a long time ago. What happened? Emil was quiet for so long that Derek thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Life happened, Officer Langston. Life happened and I wasn't strong enough to handle it. Derek waited, sensing there was more, but Emil seemed to retreat into himself. The wall Derek had seen glimpses of yesterday was fully in place now, protecting something too fragile or too painful to expose to a stranger's scrutiny. The music yesterday, Derek said, trying a different approach. It was incredible. Even on that broken piano, it was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years. Emil looked toward the piano, that flicker of longing crossing his face again. It's hard to destroy something you've loved your whole life, he said finally. Even when you want to, even when you think you should. Derek felt like he was getting somewhere, but before he could respond, Emil stood abruptly. I should go. I don't want to cause you any more trouble. You're not causing me trouble, Derek said, but Emil was already walking away, disappearing into the afternoon crowd with the same practiced invisibility Derek had witnessed the day before. Derek sat on the curb for another few minutes, staring at the piano and thinking about the man who'd once commanded standing ovations at Carnegie Hall, but now slept in homeless shelters. Whatever had driven Emil from his former life to the streets, it must have been devastating. Derek found himself wondering if there might be a way back, not just for Emil, but maybe for both of them. Emil's days had fallen into a rhythm that kept him alive, if not exactly living. Wake before dawn at the shelter, fold his blanket precisely, use the facilities while they were still relatively clean, accept the small breakfast, usually coffee that tasted like dishwater and toast that might have been fresh yesterday. Then, out to the streets, before the volunteers' smiles became strained with the effort of maintaining compassion. The orange wristband they gave him each morning served as both identification and reminder of his place in the world's hierarchy. He'd seen other homeless individuals lose these bands, watched the panic in their eyes when they couldn't prove their right to a cot and a meal. Emil kept his wrapped carefully around his wrist, another small ritual in a life that had been reduced. To small rituals, the piano drew him back every day, like a gravitational force he couldn't resist. He'd tried staying away after his encounter with Officer Langston, tried walking different routes through the city, but his feet always carried him back to Fifth and Madison. The instrument sat there, like a patient friend, asking nothing, offering everything. Emil had discovered that the piano sounded best in the early morning, before the traffic noise built up and before the heat of the day affected the remaining strings. He'd started touching the keys again, not playing exactly, but letting his fingers remember their positions, feeling the familiar resistance and response that had once been as natural as breathing. This morning was different. Officer Langston was waiting for him, sitting on the curb with a cup of coffee and what looked like a bag from the bakery down the street. "Morning, Emil," Derek said, as if they were old friends meeting for a planned breakfast. Emil approached, cautiously. In his experience, when police officers sought you out, it rarely led to anything good. "Officer Langston, is there a problem?" "No problem. I brought you breakfast." Derek held up the bag. "Figured you might be hungry." Emil stared at the offering, unsure how to respond. Acts of kindness from strangers always carried the possibility of hidden costs, expectations that might prove impossible to meet. But the smell of fresh bread was making his stomach contract with want. "Why?" Emil asked. Derek seemed to consider the question seriously. "Because I've been thinking about your music. Because I think there's more to your story, and because everyone deserves a decent breakfast sometimes." Emil accepted the bag but remained standing, ready to leave if this conversation took a direction he couldn't handle. Inside was a fresh croissant, still warm, and a container of real orange juice. The simple kindness of it made his throat tight. "I've been doing some research," Derek continued. "Your recordings, your performances. There are videos online, your Rachmaninoff Concerto No. 2 with the New York Philharmonic in 1994. It's extraordinary. Emil closed his eyes briefly. That performance had been one of his proudest moments. Sarah had been in the audience beaming with pride from the third row. The standing ovation had lasted nearly 5 minutes. You watched it? Twice. I'm not much of a classical music person, but even I could tell it was something special. Derek paused. The reviews all stopped around. 1998. You just disappeared from the music world. What happened, Emil? Emil sat down heavily on his cardboard, still clutching the breakfast Derek had brought him. The question he'd been dreading had finally arrived, and he found he was too tired to keep running from it. My wife died, Emil said simply. The words hung in the air between them. Derek waited, sensing there was more, understanding that some stories needed time to unfold. Sarah, Emil continued, his voice becoming softer. She was everything good about my life. She managed my career, but more than that, she believed in the music when I stopped believing in myself. She traveled with me, listened to me, practiced the same pieces hundreds of times, never complained when I woke up at 3 in the morning because I'd heard a passage differently in my dreams. Emil pulled out the orange juice and took a small sip, buying time before continuing. She used to say that music was our language, that when we couldn't find words for something, we could always find notes. How did she die? Derek asked gently. Emil was quiet for so long that Derek thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Car accident, 1998. She was driving to the grocery store, something completely ordinary, and a drunk driver ran a red light. Emil's hands shook slightly as he set down the juice container. She died instantly. They told me she wouldn't have suffered. Derek felt something clench in his chest. He thought about his own marriage, how he'd taken Linda for granted, how work had gradually consumed more and more of their time together until they'd become strangers sharing a house. I'm sorry, Derek said, and meant it. After the funeral, I couldn't play anymore, Emil continued. I'd sit at the piano, and all I could think about was how much she'd loved listening to me practice, how proud she'd been of every performance. Without her there, the music felt empty, pointless. So you stopped performing. I tried to keep going for a while. I had contracts, obligations, but every time I sat down to play, I could feel the absence of her listening. The music became mechanical, lifeless. Critics started noticing. They said I'd lost my passion, my emotional connection to the pieces. Emil laughed bitterly. They were right. Derek watched Emil's face as he spoke, seeing the weight of 15 years of grief and guilt etched into every line. But yesterday, when you played, there was plenty of emotion there. Yesterday was different, Emil said. Yesterday I wasn't trying to be Emil Novak the pianist. I was just playing music because you told me to. It was the first time in years that I played without thinking about what I'd lost. Derek understood something then about the power of expectations, about how sometimes the things we love most can become impossible to approach when they're weighted down with too much meaning. Where have you been living? I mean, since 1998? That's 27 years. Emil's smile was sad. Everywhere and nowhere. I sold the house, gave away most of Sarah's things, traveled for a while, trying to find somewhere that didn't remind me of our life together. Ran through the money eventually. Ended up in shelters on the streets. Phoenix is warm most of the year. Easier to survive here than some places. Derek found himself angry on Emil's behalf, angry at a world that could let someone with such extraordinary gifts fall so far, angry at the systems that were supposed to catch people before they hit bottom but so often failed. Have you thought about playing again? Professionally, I mean? Emil shook his head quickly. That life is over. Has been for a long time. But Derek had seen the way Emil's hands moved on the piano keys, had heard the music that emerged despite the broken instrument. Whatever had driven Emil to the streets, the music was still there. Waiting. Maybe, Derek said carefully. It doesn't have to be. Derek began stopping by 5th and Madison every day, timing his visits to coincide with Emil's morning routine. What started as professional curiosity had evolved into something else. a genuine concern for a man whose story had touched something Derek hadn't realized was still alive inside him. Emil's initial wariness gradually gave way to cautious acceptance of Derek's presence. They developed an unspoken routine. Derek would bring coffee and something to eat, Emil would share small pieces of his past, and they would sit together in comfortable silence, watching the city wake up around them. It was during one of these morning conversations that Derek noticed the wedding ring. Thin gold, worn smooth by decades of wear, it caught the early sunlight as Emil gestured while speaking about his years at Juilliard. The ring was obviously precious to him. Derek had watched him unconsciously twist it whenever their conversations touched on difficult subjects. "You still wear your wedding ring," Derek observed one morning. Emil looked down at his hand as if surprised to find the ring there. "I've tried to take it off several times over the years, but it feels like I'd be letting go of the last piece of her." Derek understood that feeling more than he wanted to admit. His own wedding ring sat in a drawer at home, removed after. The divorce papers were signed, but never quite thrown away. "Tell me about her, about Sarah." Emil's face softened in a way Derek had never seen before. "She was a music teacher when I met her. Elementary school kids mostly, though she also gave private piano lessons to help pay the bills. I was performing at a small venue in Cleveland. This was 1985, before the Carnegie Hall debut, and she was there with some friends." Emil smiled at the memory. "After the performance, she came up to me and said, 'That was beautiful, but you rushed the adagio movement in the Chopin. The emotion needs more time to breathe.' I was so shocked that someone had noticed and that she was right, that I asked her to dinner just to continue the conversation. She knew music. She knew everything about music that mattered. Technical skill, yes, but more importantly, she understood what music was supposed to do to people's hearts. She could listen to me play and know immediately if I was going through the motions or if I was really connecting with the piece." Derek found himself thinking about his own marriage, about the ways Linda had tried to connect with his work, his interests, his inner life. How often had he been too tired or too distracted to really engage with her attempts at intimacy? "She sounds like she was good for you," Derek said. "She was everything for me," Emil replied. "After we married, she quit teaching to manage my career full-time. She arranged my bookings, handled the business side of things, traveled with me to every performance. But more than that, she was my anchor. The music business can be very isolating, very competitive. Sarah kept me grounded in what mattered." Emil twisted the ring again, a gesture Derek was beginning to recognize as a sign that the conversation was approaching painful territory. "She wanted children. We tried for years, went through all the medical procedures, the disappointments. It never happened. I think sometimes she lived her maternal instincts through my music, nurturing it the way she would have nurtured children." Derek felt a familiar ache in his chest. He and Linda had talked about children early in their marriage, but police work had always seemed too dangerous, too demanding. There was always going to be a better time, a safer time, a time when Derek felt more ready to be a father. By the time he'd realized that the perfect time would never come, Linda had stopped bringing up the subject. "She sounds like an amazing woman," Derek said. "She was. And I failed her." The words came out flat, matter of fact, as if Emil was stating something as obvious as the color of the sky. Derek felt the conversation shift into deeper water. "How did you fail her?" Emil was quiet for a long time, staring at the piano as if it might provide answers he'd been searching for across 15 years of guilt. "By the mid-90s, my career was really taking off. International tours, recording contracts, offers from major orchestras. It was everything we'd worked toward, everything Sarah had sacrificed her own career to help me achieve." Derek waited, sensing the weight of what was coming. But success in the music world, it's intoxicating and demanding. I was traveling more, practicing longer hours when I was home, always focused on the next performance, the next recording, the next opportunity. Sarah managed the logistics, but I was living inside the music in a way that left little room for anything else. Emile's voice became quieter. She started seeming tired all the time, withdrawn. When I asked about it, she'd say she was fine, just busy with managing my schedule. I believed her because it was easier than slowing down to really look at what was happening. Derek thought about his own marriage, about how many times Linda had mentioned feeling lonely, feeling like Derek was physically present but emotionally elsewhere. How many times had he dismissed her concerns as temporary, something they'd deal with when things were less busy at work? Depression, Emile continued, wasn't something people talked about openly in the 90s. Especially not successful people. Sarah was good at maintaining appearances, at making sure everything looked perfect from the outside. But she was drowning, and I was too self-absorbed to notice. Derek felt a familiar tightness in his chest. When did you realize something was seriously wrong? Too late, Emile said simply. She'd been seeing a therapist, apparently. Had been. Prescribed medication. I found the pill bottles after the accident, still full. She'd been struggling for months, maybe years, and I never noticed because I was too busy chasing the next standing ovation. The pain in Emile's voice was raw, unhealed, despite the passage of years. Derek recognized the particular agony of guilt that came from realizing you'd failed someone you loved, not through malice, but through blindness. Emile, depression it's an illness. It's not something you could have fixed by paying more attention. Emile turned to look at Derek directly for the first time since the conversation began. Maybe not, but I could have tried. I could have been present for her struggle instead of absent for my success. The accident, it happened on a Tuesday afternoon. She was driving to the grocery store because I'd asked her to pick up something special for a dinner I was cooking to celebrate getting a recording contract. She died running an errand for my career. Derek wanted to say something comforting, something that might ease the burden Emile had been carrying, but he recognized the futility of trying to argue with guilt this deep-seated. Instead, he simply sat with Emile in the weight of the revelation. Is that when you stopped playing? Not immediately. I tried to continue, told myself it was what Sarah would have wanted, but every performance felt like a betrayal. How could I stand on stage accepting applause for creating beauty when I'd been too blind to see my wife's pain? How could I pour my heart into music for strangers when I'd failed to give her the attention she needed? Derek understood then why. Emile had disappeared from the music world, why someone with such extraordinary gifts had chosen the streets over the stage. The music that had once connected him to Sarah had become a reminder of everything he'd lost through his own failures. But yesterday, Derek said carefully, when you played, yesterday was the first time in 15 years that I played without thinking about what the music cost, Emile finished. It was the first time the notes didn't sound like an apology. Derek looked at Emile's weathered hands, at the wedding ring that still caught the morning light, at the man who'd punished himself with homelessness for crimes that might exist only in his own mind. He thought about his own guilt over his failed marriage, his own tendency to throw himself into work rather than face the complexity of human relationships. Maybe, Derek said slowly, maybe the music doesn't have to be about what you lost. Maybe it could be about what you still have. Emile looked skeptical. What do I still have? Derek gestured toward the piano, toward the place where Emile had created something beautiful from something broken. The ability to make people stop and listen. The ability to create something that matters. The gift that Sarah supported and believed in. It's still there. Emile shook his head. That life is over. Maybe that life is over, Derek agreed. But maybe there's a different life possible. One that honors Sarah's memory instead of hiding from it. Emile fell silent, and Derek could see him wrestling with the possibility. Around them, the city continued its morning rhythm. Commuters hurrying to work, shop owners unlocking their doors. The gradual build of noise and activity that marked another day beginning. For the first time since he'd met Emile, Derek felt like they were approaching something that might resemble hope. Derek's visits to Emil had not gone unnoticed at the precinct. Detective Santos cornered him in the break room one afternoon, her expression mixing concern with frustration. "Okay, what's going on with you and the homeless pianist?" she asked without preamble. Derek looked up from his coffee. "What do you mean?" "I mean, half the department knows you're spending your lunch breaks and off-duty time with some guy who lives on the streets. Captain Rodriguez asked me if you were having some kind of breakdown." Derek felt a familiar flash of irritation. "I'm following up on a case." "For 3 weeks?" "Derek, the guy isn't committing crimes. There's no case to follow." "Up on." Maria sat down across from him, her voice softening. "Look, I get it. You're going through a rough patch. The divorce hit you hard, and you're looking for something to care about. But getting this involved with a homeless individual, it's not healthy. For you or for him." Derek wanted to explain about Emil's background, about the extraordinary music, and the tragic story, but he knew how it would sound. "He's not just some homeless guy, Maria. I know you think that. But Derek, we see this all the time. People who claim they used to be doctors or lawyers or famous musicians. Half the homeless population downtown thinks they're somebody they're not. It's a coping mechanism. I've seen the documentation, the reviews, the recordings, the performance. Videos? He really was a famous pianist." Maria looked skeptical. "Even if that's true, so what? That was decades ago. People fall apart for all kinds of reasons. You can't save them all." Derek knew Maria was right about the broader principle, but she didn't understand what he'd witnessed. She hadn't heard Emil play, hadn't seen the transformation that occurred. When his fingers touched the piano keys, more troubling was what Derek had found when he dug deeper into Emil's story. After Sarah's death, Emil hadn't just stopped performing. He'd essentially vanished. There were no medical records Derek could access, no legal troubles, no obvious explanation for how someone could fall so far so completely. But there had been one detail that nagged at Derek. In the obituary for Sarah Novak, the cause of death was listed as injuries sustained in an automobile accident. Standard language, except that Derek had learned to read between the lines of such official statements. He'd requested the accident report through official channels, something that took several days to process. When the report arrived, Derek felt his stomach sink. Sarah Novak had indeed died in a car accident, but there were details that painted a more complex picture. She'd been alone in the car. There were no skid marks at the scene. The toxicology report showed therapeutic levels of antidepressants in her system, which Emil had mentioned, but also something else that gave Derek pause. According to the investigating officer's notes, Sarah had recently increased her dosage of medication after what her doctor described as a significant depressive episode. There were also references to statements made by the deceased to family members that suggested she'd been struggling more than Emil realized. Derek stared at the report for a long time, understanding now why Emil carried such crushing guilt. The accident may have been officially ruled accidental, but the circumstances suggested something far more complicated. Whether Sarah had intentionally driven into oncoming traffic or simply been too mentally compromised to react appropriately, Emil would never know for certain. The ambiguity would be almost worse than certainty. Derek folded the report and locked it in his desk drawer. This was information Emil didn't need to see, details that would only deepen wounds that had never properly healed. That evening, Derek found Emil at the shelter where he'd been staying. The building was a converted warehouse that housed about 60 people on any given night. The smell of industrial disinfectant and unwashed bodies hit Derek as soon as he walked through the doors. Emil was sitting on a narrow cot, reading a paperback book that looked like it had been read by dozens of people before him. He looked up in surprise when Derek approached. "Officer Langston, is everything all right?" Derek sat down on a plastic chair beside Emil's cot. Around them, the shelter's residents went about their evening routines. Some playing cards, others watching television, many simply lying down and staring at the ceiling. "I wanted to ask you about something." Derek said carefully, "about Sarah's death." Emil's expression immediately became guarded. What about it? Derek had debated how much to reveal, how much truth would be helpful versus harmful. "I read the accident report. There were some details that, well, they suggest Sarah might have been struggling more than you realized." Emil was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I found her pill bottles afterward, the antidepressants. They were barely touched. She'd been prescribed them months earlier, but hadn't been taking them consistently." "Did you know she was seeing a therapist?" Emil nodded slowly. "I found the appointment cards in her purse. She'd been going twice a week for nearly a year. I never knew." His voice broke slightly. "She'd told me she was running errands, meeting friends for lunch. I never questioned it because I was too busy to pay attention." Derek felt the weight of Emil's guilt settling over them both. "Emil, even if you'd known, if I'd known she might still be alive," Emil interrupted. "If I'd been present in our marriage instead of lost in my career, she might have felt comfortable telling me about the therapy, about the medication, about how dark things had gotten for her." Derek wanted to argue, wanted to point out that depression was complex and that sometimes people hid their struggles no matter how much love surrounded them. But he also understood that guilt wasn't always rational, that sometimes people needed to carry blame even when it wasn't entirely theirs to bear. "The accident report," Derek said carefully, "it mentions that the investigating officer had some questions about whether it was really an accident," Emil finished. "Yes, I know. They questioned me extensively after the funeral. Wanted to know about Sarah's mental state, about our marriage, about whether she'd given any indication of suicidal thoughts." Emil pulled something from beneath his pillow, a small plastic hospital bracelet, faded and worn. "This was on her wrist when they brought her to the hospital, the last thing she wore that connected her to me, to our life together." Derek looked at the bracelet, reading Sarah's name and the date, July 15th, 1998. He understood now why Emil kept it, why the guilt had driven him from concert halls to homeless shelters. "The truth is," Emil continued, "I'll never know if Sarah drove into that intersection intentionally or if it was really an accident. Either way, I failed her. Either way, she died alone. In pain, I never tried to understand." Derek sat with Emil in the fluorescent-lit shelter, surrounded by the quiet desperation of people who'd lost their place in the world, and understood that some wounds were too deep for easy healing. But maybe, he thought, healing wasn't about forgetting the pain. Maybe it was about learning to carry it differently. Derek couldn't sleep. The conversation with Emil about Sarah's death had left him restless, turning over details that didn't quite fit together. At 3 in the morning, he found himself back at his laptop, pulling up everything he could find about Sarah Novak's death. The Phoenix Police Department had access to databases that allowed him to request records from other jurisdictions. It took some paperwork and a few favors from colleagues, but Derek managed to get a complete copy of the Cleveland Police Department's investigation file on Sarah's accident. What he found made his hands shake. The file contained witness statements Derek hadn't seen in the initial report. A driver in the oncoming lane reported that Sarah's car had crossed the center line deliberately, like she was aiming for the truck. Another witness described seeing Sarah sitting motionless in her car for several minutes at a red light before proceeding into the intersection, not through a green light, but directly into traffic that had the right of way. Most damaging was a statement from Sarah's therapist, Dr. Rachel Morrison, who had contacted police after learning of her patient's death. Dr. Morrison reported that Sarah had missed her last 3 scheduled appointments and had spoken repeatedly about feeling like a burden to Emil's career. In their final session, Sarah had expressed guilt about being unable to have children and worry that her depression was holding Emil back from his full potential. The therapist's notes, included in the file, painted a picture of a woman who felt increasingly isolated despite being surrounded by the glittering world of classical music. Sarah had described feeling like a supporting character in someone else's success story and had questioned whether Emile would be better off without her complications. Most chilling was Dr. Morrison's final note. Patient has expressed passive, suicidal ideation and has been resistant to medication compliance. Recommend increased supervision and possible hospitalization if symptoms worsen. Derek stared at the screen, understanding now that Sarah's death hadn't been an accident at all. She had driven into oncoming traffic intentionally, ending her life. While Emile was at home, preparing a celebratory dinner for his latest career achievement. Derek closed the laptop and sat in his dark apartment, wrestling with the implications of what he'd discovered. Emile had been carrying guilt for 15 years over failing to notice his wife's depression. But the truth was far worse. Sarah had killed herself while Emile was literally celebrating his own success in the next room. The question now was whether Emile knew. Had he suspected all these years that Sarah's death was suicide, or had he genuinely believed it was an accident? And either way, was it Derek's place to reveal the truth? Derek thought about his own marriage, about the subtle ways Linda had tried to tell him she was unhappy before she finally asked for a divorce. How many signs had he missed? How many times had work taken priority over the person he'd promised? To love and protect, the parallel was too close for comfort. Derek had been failing his own marriage through neglect while investigating another man's more tragic version of the same failure. The next morning, Derek found Emile at their usual spot beside the piano. Emile looked tired, as if he hadn't slept. Well, either. They sat in their customary silence for several minutes before Derek worked up the courage to speak. Emile, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Emile looked up, perhaps sensing the seriousness in Derek's tone. What is it? Do you think Sarah's death was really an accident? Emile's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, pain, and finally something that might have been relief. He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. I've wondered, Emile said finally. For 15 years I've wondered. There were things that didn't make sense if it was just an accident. What kind of things? She'd given away some of her jewelry the week before, pieces that had been her mother's, things she treasured. She said she was simplifying, but it felt strange at the time, and she'd been different those last few weeks. Not just sad, but calm in a way that worried me, like she'd made peace with something. Derek felt his heart sink. Emile had suspected all along. The police asked me if she'd ever talked about suicide, Emile continued. I told them no, because she'd never used that word specifically, but looking back, she'd made comments about feeling like a burden, about wondering if I'd be better off without her complications. I thought she was just having a bad day when she said those things. I thought they'd pass. Derek pulled out the police file and handed it to Emile. I'm sorry, but I think you should see this. Emile read through the witness statements and the therapist's notes with growing horror. Derek watched the color drain from his face as the full truth of Sarah's final months became clear. She planned it, Emile whispered. She'd been planning it for weeks, maybe months. While I was practicing for concerts, while I was excited about recording contracts, she was planning to kill herself. Emile, the dinner I was cooking that night. She knew she wouldn't be there to eat it. She sent herself on that errand knowing she wouldn't be coming back. Emile's voice broke. She said goodbye that morning, and I didn't even realize it. She kissed me and said she loved me, and I was already thinking about the studio session I had later that week. Derek watched 15 years of carefully constructed grief collapse into something raw and more devastating. Emile had been living with guilt over missing the signs of Sarah's depression, but now he had to confront the reality that she'd hidden her suicidal intentions so completely that even her therapist had been caught off guard. This changes everything, Emile said, staring at the police report. All these years, I thought if I'd just paid more attention, been more present, I could have saved her. But she didn't want to be saved. She wanted to escape. Derek understood. Now why Emile had disappeared from the music world so completely. It wasn't just grief over an accidental loss. It was the crushing realization that his wife had chosen death over life with him, that his success had somehow become so burdensome to her that suicide felt like her only option. She left a note, Emile said suddenly, in her purse. The police never told me about it. Derek looked back at the file and found what Emile was referring to. A brief, handwritten note that had been entered into evidence but apparently never shared with Emile. Derek, read it aloud. Emile, I'm sorry I can't be the wife your success deserves. You were meant for greatness and I've become an anchor holding you back. Don't let my sadness dim your light. Play beautifully. Play for both of us. I love you always. Sarah. Emile buried his face in his hands. She killed herself because she thought she was holding back my career. She thought my life would be better without her in it. The irony was devastating. Sarah had committed suicide to free Emile from what she perceived as the burden of her depression, but her death had destroyed his ability to find joy in the very success she died to protect. Emile, listen to me, Derek said urgently. Sarah was sick. Depression lies to people, makes them believe things that aren't true. You weren't better off without her. Your life wasn't more successful because she was gone. She was wrong about that. But Derek could see that Emile was already retreating into a guilt deeper than anything he'd carried before. The man who'd spent 15 years punishing himself for failing to save his wife now had to face the possibility that she'd never wanted to be saved at all. I need to be alone, Emile said, standing abruptly. Emile, wait. But Emile was already walking away, leaving Derek sitting beside the piano with a police file that had just shattered a man's carefully constructed understanding of the worst day of his life. Derek watched Emile disappear into the morning crowd and realized that sometimes the truth wasn't healing. Sometimes the truth was just another kind of devastation, one that made the original pain seem simple by comparison. Derek didn't see Emile for 3 days after revealing the truth about Sarah's suicide. He checked the shelter, walked the streets, around 5th and Madison, even asked other homeless individuals if they'd seen the elderly man who sometimes played piano. Nothing. On the 4th day, Derek found Emile sitting in a small park about 2 miles from their usual meeting spot. He looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of the new information had physically diminished him. His eyes were red-rimmed, his clothes more disheveled than usual. I've been thinking, Emile said without looking up when Derek sat beside him on the bench, about what Sarah wrote in that note, about her thinking she was holding me back. Derek waited, sensing that Emile needed to work through this in his own way. The terrible thing is, part of me wonders if she was right. Emile continued, not about being better off without her. I would have given up every concert, every recording, every moment of success to have her back, but about the burden. Emile, no, let me finish. The last few years of her life, I was so focused on building my career that I stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as part of the machinery that made my success possible. She managed my schedule, she handled the logistics, she smiled at the dinner parties with music industry people even when I could see how exhausted she was. Emile finally looked at Derek. I turned the woman I loved into an employee of my ambition, and when she started struggling, I didn't want to slow down long enough to help her heal because it might interfere with the momentum we'd built. Derek thought about his own marriage, about how many times Linda had asked him to take time off, to prioritize their relationship over his cases, to be present instead of always thinking about the next crisis at work. We all make mistakes, Derek said. That doesn't mean we deserve to have the people we love choose death over life with us. But what if she was right about one thing? Emile asked. What if I was meant for something more than I became? What if her death was supposed to teach me something about what really matters, and instead I just disappeared? Derek could see where this was heading, and it worried him. What are you thinking? Emile was quiet for a long moment. There's a community center about 10 blocks from here. They have a small concert space, and they do fundraising events for homeless services. I saw a flyer yesterday. They're having their annual benefit concert next month, and I'm thinking about asking if they'd let me perform. Derek felt a mixture of excitement and concern. Emil, that would be incredible. But are you sure you're ready for something like that? Public performance, media attention? I'm not sure about anything, Emil admitted. But I keep thinking about what Sarah wrote. Play beautifully. Play for both of us. Maybe she meant that literally. Maybe the way to honor her memory isn't to hide from music, but to use it differently. Derek studied Emil's face, trying to gauge whether this was genuine healing or another form of self-punishment. What would be different about performing now versus when you stopped 15 years ago? Then I was playing for my own glory, for the applause, for the reviews, for the career advancement. I thought that's what Sarah wanted because it's what I wanted. Emil paused. But maybe now I could play for something else, for the people in the shelter who need to remember they're more than their circumstances. For Sarah, to show that her love for music didn't die with her. For myself, to prove that something good can come from all this pain. Derek felt something stirring in his chest, hope, maybe, or just recognition of courage in the face of devastating loss. Have you played anything since that day you read the police report? Emil shook his head. I've been afraid to. Afraid that, now that I know the truth, the music would sound different. That it would sound like Sarah's farewell instead of something beautiful. There's only one way to find out. Emil looked toward the park's exit, in the direction of 5th and Madison. Will you come with me to the piano? Derek nodded, and they walked together through the late afternoon streets. The piano was still there, looking even more battered than usual. Someone had spray-painted graffiti on one side, and several more. Keys had become completely silent. Emil sat at the bench and placed his hands on the keyboard, but he didn't press any keys. He sat like that for several minutes, eyes closed, breathing slowly. I don't know what to play, he said finally. Play whatever comes to you, Derek suggested. Don't think about it. Emil's fingers found the keys hesitantly, picking out a simple melody Derek didn't recognize. It was slow, contemplative, touched with sadness but not overwhelmed by it. As Emil continued, the melody developed into something more complex, more assured. Derek realized he was listening to a composition he'd never heard before, something Emil was creating in real time, drawing from 15 years of grief and loss. A newly discovered truth. A few people stopped to listen, then a few more. By the time Emil finished the improvised piece, a small crowd had gathered, their faces reflecting the same wonder Derek had felt during that first performance weeks. Emil opened his eyes and looked at the faces around him. Thank you, he said quietly, and Derek could see something had shifted. The music hadn't sounded like farewell. It had sounded like possibility. After the crowd dispersed, Derek and Emil sat together in the late afternoon light. I want to do the benefit concert, Emil said, but I'm going to need help. I don't have proper clothes. I haven't performed in public in 15 years, and I'm not sure I remember how to be around people who aren't homeless or police officers. Derek smiled. What kind of help do you need? Would you help me prepare? I know it's asking a lot, and I know you have your own life to deal with. Emil, Derek interrupted, I'd be honored to help you. Over the next hour they made plans. Derek would contact the community center about getting Emil on the benefit concert program. They'd find proper performance clothing, arrange for practice time on a real piano, help Emil prepare for media attention if it came. Derek found himself energized by the project in a way he hadn't felt about anything in months. For the first time since his divorce, he had something to focus on besides his own failures and disappointments. There's one more thing, Emil said as they prepared to part ways. The piece I want to perform. I want to write something new. Something specifically for this concert, for Sarah's memory, for all the people who've lost their way and are trying to find it again. How long do you think that will take? I don't know. I haven't composed anything in 20 years, but I have. Some ideas, some themes I want to explore. Emil touched his wedding ring. I want to write something that sounds like forgiveness. Not just Sarah forgiving me, but me forgiving myself. And maybe Sarah forgiving herself too. Derek felt the weight of what Emil was proposing. This wouldn't just be a performance, it would be a public working through of grief, guilt, and the possibility of redemption. Are you sure you want to do this so publicly? Derek asked. There might be media attention, people asking questions about where you've been. I'm tired of hiding, Emil said simply. Sarah spent the last months of her life hiding her pain, and it killed her. I've spent 15 years hiding mine, and it's been killing me slowly. Maybe it's time to stop hiding. Derek looked at the determination in Emil's face and realized that whatever happened at the benefit concert, Emil Novak was already beginning to heal. The man who disappeared from the world after his wife's death was starting to find his way back, not to his old life, but to something entirely new. The benefit concert was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks for Emil to compose new music, prepare for public performance, and transform himself from a homeless man into a pianist, ready to bare his soul in front of an audience. 6 weeks for Derek to help orchestrate what might be either Emil's triumphant return or his most devastating failure yet. But as they shook hands before parting ways, Derek felt something he'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope that broken things could be repaired, that lost people could be found, that music really could heal the deepest wounds if someone was brave enough to let it try. The night of the benefit concert arrived with unseasonable coolness, as if the desert was offering its blessing for the evening's events. Derek stood in the wings of the Phoenix Community Center's small auditorium, watching Emil pace back and forth in the ill-fitting but clean black suit they'd managed to find at a thrift store. Emil's hands were shaking. He'd been practicing for weeks on the community center's upright piano during their off hours. But tonight he would be performing on the restored Steinway Grand that dominated the small stage. The difference between the two instruments was vast, like comparing a pencil sketch to an oil painting. The keys feel different, Emil murmured for the third time in 10 minutes. Heavier, more responsive. I'm afraid I'll overplay the dynamics. Derek had watched Emil's preparation over the past 6 weeks with a mixture of admiration and concern. The composition Emil had written, titled simply For Sarah, was unlike anything Derek had expected. Instead of the mournful dirge he'd anticipated, Emil had created something that moved through grief into acceptance, through darkness into a tentative, hard-won hope. But preparing the music had been only part of the challenge. Emil had to relearn how to be around people, how to accept kindness without suspicion, how to believe he deserved a place on stage rather than on the streets. Some days had been better than others. Remember what we practiced, Derek said quietly. Don't think about the audience. Think about the conversation you're having with Sarah through the music. Emil nodded, but Derek could see the terror in his eyes. This wasn't just performance anxiety. This was a man who'd spent 15 years convincing himself he didn't deserve to create beauty, now being asked to do exactly that in front of 200 people who'd paid to support homeless services. Yeah, irony wasn't lost on either of them. 5 minutes, Mr. Novak, the stage manager whispered. Emil closed his eyes and took several deep breaths. Derek watched him transform before his eyes, the nervous, shaking man gradually disappearing, replaced by something more centered, more focused. It was like watching someone remember who they used to be. Derek, Emil said suddenly, thank you for everything, for seeing something in me when I couldn't see it myself. Derek felt his throat tighten. You did the hard part. You chose to come back. Emil walked to the edge of the stage, where he could see a corner of the audience through the gap in the curtains. Derek followed his gaze and saw faces filled with anticipation. Some who'd come because they'd heard about the mysterious homeless pianist, others who simply supported the community center's work. In the front row sat Maria Santos, who'd reluctantly agreed to attend after Derek's weeks of gentle persuasion. Beside her was Captain Rodriguez, who'd become unexpectedly invested in Emil's story after Derek had shared some of the details. Even Linda was there, in the third row, having responded to Derek's invitation with surprise but genuine interest. Derek had been amazed by how quickly news of Emil's performance had spread once the community center had announced it. A local newspaper had picked up the story of the former Carnegie Hall performer who'd been living homeless for 15 years. From there, classical music blogs had found the story, then larger media outlets. Emil had been anxious about the attention, worried that publicity would turn his attempt at healing into a spectacle. But Derek had helped him see it differently. Every person who heard Emil's story was someone who might look at homeless individuals with more compassion, someone who might understand that every person on the streets had a history that deserved respect. "Mr. Novak, you're on," the stage manager said. Emil turned to Derek one last time. "What if I can't do it? What if I get out there and freeze?" Derek thought about all the conversations they'd had over the past 2 months. All the gradual trust building, all the careful work of helping Emil believe he was worthy of redemption. "Then you'll sit at that piano for as long as you need to, until you remember why Sarah fell in love with your music in the first place," Derek said. "And if you can't remember that, then you'll play for all the people in this audience who need to believe that second chances are possible." Emil smiled. The first truly peaceful smile Derek had seen from him since they'd met. "Places, please," the stage manager whispered. Emil walked onto the stage, and Derek felt his heart pound as if he were the one about to perform. The audience applauded politely as Emil made his way to the piano bench, but Derek could sense their curiosity. Many of them had read the newspaper articles, knew something of Emil's story, but seeing him in person was different. Emil sat at the bench and adjusted its height slightly. He placed his hands on the keyboard, then lifted them, then placed them again. Derek could see him gathering himself, finding his center. The auditorium fell completely silent. Derek counted the seconds. 10, 15, 20. Emil's hands remained poised over the keys, but he hadn't begun to play. Derek could see the tension in Emil's shoulders, the slight tremor in his fingers that spoke of stage fright beyond anything he'd experienced during their practice sessions. Then Emil lowered his hands to his lap and sat perfectly still for another long moment. Derek held his breath, wondering if this was the moment Emil would stand up and walk away, unable to complete the journey they'd begun together. Instead, Emil spoke into the silence. His voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the acoustically designed space. 15 years ago, I lost my wife to suicide, Emil said simply. I thought I lost my music with her. Tonight, I'm trying to find it again. This piece is called For Sarah, and it's about learning that love doesn't end with death. It just changes shape. Derek felt tears prick his eyes. They hadn't rehearsed any speaking, hadn't planned for Emil to address the audience directly, but somehow, in his moment of greatest vulnerability, Emil had found exactly the right words. Emil placed his hands on the keys again, and this time he began to play. The opening notes were soft, tentative, like someone testing the temperature of water before diving in. But as Emil's confidence built, the music grew stronger, more assured. Derek recognized the themes Emil had been working on during their practice sessions, but hearing them performed on the Steinway with proper acoustics transformed them into something transcendent. The composition began in a minor key, slow and mournful, clearly representing grief and loss. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, Emil began weaving in variations that suggested something else. Not the absence of sadness, but the presence of something deeper. Memory, perhaps, or gratitude for what had been, even though it was gone. Derek watched the audience as Emil played, seeing faces that had been politely attentive become genuinely moved. An elderly woman in the second row had tears streaming down her cheeks. A man near the back had closed his eyes and was swaying slightly. With the music, Emil's hands moved across the keyboard with increasing confidence, and Derek could see the transformation happening in real time. This wasn't the broken man who'd been living in shelters and sitting beside abandoned pianos. This was Emil Novak, the pianist, reclaiming his place in the world through the only language that had ever made complete sense to him. The music built toward what Derek recognized as the climactic passage, the moment where grief and acceptance would meet, where Emil would either find redemption or be overwhelmed by the emotions he was channeling through his fingertips. As Emil moved into the climactic passage of his composition, Derek could see something shifting in his posture. The careful control he'd maintained during the opening movements gave way to something raw, more emotionally exposed. His whole body began to move with the music, shoulders swaying, head tilting, as if he were listening to voices only he could hear. The melody transformed from mournful remembrance into something more complex, a musical conversation between grief and hope, between what was lost and what remained. Derek realized he was witnessing Emil's public processing of 15 years of guilt and pain, all channeled through his extraordinary gifts. In the audience, the silence was complete. No one coughed, no one shifted in their seats. Even the usual background noise of the building's ventilation system seemed to have quieted in respect for what was happening on stage. Emil's hands found passages that Derek had never heard during their practice sessions, improvisational flourishes that suggested years of musical ideas that had been suppressed, waiting for this moment to emerge. The composition was expanding in real time, becoming something larger and more profound than what Emil had originally written. Derek saw Emil's lips moving slightly, as if he were having a conversation with Sarah through the music. The intensity of emotion crossing Emil's face was almost too intimate to witness. This was a man saying goodbye, asking forgiveness, and finding peace all at the same time. The music reached its emotional crescendo, a passage so beautiful and heartbreaking that Derek heard audible sobs from the audience. Emil's entire being was channeled through his fingertips, every note carrying the weight of years of unspoken words, unprocessed grief, and newly discovered hope. Then, as the piece moved toward its conclusion, something extraordinary happened. Emil's playing took on a quality Derek had never heard before. Not just technical mastery or emotional depth, but something that transcended both. It was as if Sarah herself was somehow present in the music, as if Emil had found a way to honor both her memory and his own survival. The final notes rang out in the silence, sustained by the piano's resonance and the held breath of 200 people who had just witnessed something they would never forget. Emil's hands remained on the keys for a long moment after the sound faded, his head bowed as if in prayer. Then he lifted his head and looked out at the audience, and Derek saw that his face was wet with tears, but they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of release, of completion, of a burden finally shared instead of carried alone. For several seconds, the audience sat in stunned silence. Then, as if awakening from a trance, they began to applaud. It started slowly, tentatively, then built into something Derek had never experienced before, a standing ovation that felt less like appreciation and more like witness to a sacred moment. Emil stood slowly from the piano bench, clearly overwhelmed by the response. He bowed deeply, then placed his hand over his heart and bowed again. The applause continued, building rather than diminishing, as if the audience understood they had been present for something extraordinary. Derek saw faces throughout the auditorium, people laughing and crying simultaneously, strangers embracing, everyone united in recognition of what they had just shared. Maria Santos was wiping tears from her eyes. Captain Rodriguez was clapping with an expression of wonder Derek had never seen on his weathered face. Even Linda was standing, applauding with genuine emotion. Emil remained on stage for nearly 5 minutes, accepting the audience's gratitude, with a grace that spoke of his years of professional performance, but also with a humility that acknowledged the journey he'd taken to arrive at this moment. When the applause finally began to subside, Emil raised his hand and spoke again. "Thank you," he said simply. "For 15 years, I believed I had nothing left to give. Tonight, you've helped me remember that healing is possible, that music can transform pain into something beautiful, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can offer is our own brokenness made whole." The audience erupted again, and Derek felt something shift inside his own chest, a recognition that he had just witnessed not only Emil's redemption, but also a kind of healing he hadn't known he needed for himself. Emil walked off stage toward Derek, and they embraced without words. Derek could feel Emil shaking, not with fear now, but with the aftermath of having poured 15 years of emotion into 20 minutes of music. "How do you feel?" Derek asked when Emil had caught his breath. Emil was quiet for a moment, considering. "I feel like I can finally hear Sarah's voice clearly," he said, "and she's not asking me to punish myself anymore. She's asking me to live." Derek looked back toward the stage, where the piano sat bathed in spotlight, and understood that this moment would change both their lives. Emil had found his way back to music, but more than that, he had found his way back to himself. The benefit concert had raised money for homeless services, but it had accomplished something far more valuable. It had proven that redemption was possible, that broken people could heal, and that sometimes the most beautiful music emerges from the deepest pain. Emil Novak was no longer a homeless man who used to be a pianist. He was a pianist who had survived homelessness and emerged with something profound to share with the world. 6 months after the benefit concert, Derek found Emil exactly where he'd expected, in the music room of the Phoenix Community Center, working with a group of teenagers who'd been referred by the juvenile court system. Emil's approach to teaching was unlike anything the center had seen before. He didn't just teach technique. He taught music as a language for emotions that were too complex for words. Derek watched through the doorway as Emil worked with Marcus, a 17-year-old who'd been arrested for vandalism and sentenced to community service. Marcus had been sullen and uncooperative with every other program the center had tried, but something about Emil's quiet patience had reached him. "Don't think about playing the right notes," Emil was saying. "Think about what you're feeling right now, anger, frustration, whatever it is, and let that feeling guide your fingers. The piano can handle your emotions. It's designed for it." Marcus's hands moved hesitantly across the keys, producing a choppy, discordant sound that would have made most teachers wince. But Emil nodded encouragingly. "Good. Now try to have a conversation with that anger. What does it want to tell you? What's underneath it?" Derek had watched this process dozens of times over the past months. Emil had an uncanny ability to help people find their own voices through music, regardless of their technical skill level. The community center had started a waiting list for his classes. The transformation in Emil himself was equally remarkable. He'd gained weight. His clothes were clean and well-fitted, and most importantly, he'd regained the bearing of someone who knew his worth in the world. He'd moved into a small apartment 3 blocks from the center, furnished sparsely but comfortably, with donations from people who'd heard his story. More significantly, Emil had begun composing again, not for concert halls or recording contracts, but for the people he worked with, simple pieces that helped trauma survivors process their experiences, melodies that gave voice to emotions that couldn't be spoken aloud. Derek knocked on the doorframe, and Emil looked up with a smile that had become genuine over the months. "Officer Langston," Marcus said, recognizing Derek from previous visits. "Mr. Emil's been teaching me how to play angry." "How to channel anger into music," Emil corrected gently. "There's a difference between playing angry and playing with anger." Derek understood the distinction. He'd been applying similar principles to his own life since watching Emil's transformation. Instead of letting his frustration with police work and his failed marriage consume him, Derek had started volunteering with the community center's outreach program, finding ways to help homeless individuals before they reached crisis points. His work had led to a promotion, community liaison officer, a position that allowed him to build bridges between law enforcement and social services. It was work that felt meaningful in ways that routine patrol had never managed. "I'll let you finish up," Derek told Emil. "Just wanted to see how things were going." "Actually," Emil said, "could you stay for a minute? Marcus has something he wants to share." Marcus looked nervous but determined. "I wrote something, a song." "Kind of. Mr. Emil helped me put it to music." Derek settled into a chair as Marcus turned back to the piano. What emerged was raw and unpolished, but undeniably powerful. A melody that spoke of anger and loss, but also of hope struggling to emerge from difficult circumstances. Derek found himself moved by the young man's honesty, by his willingness to be vulnerable through music. When Marcus finished, the room was quiet for a moment before Derek began applauding. "That was incredible, Marcus. Really?" Marcus beamed, and Derek could see how Emil's teaching had given him something he'd never had before. A way to express himself that felt authentic and valuable. After the class ended and the students had left, Derek and Emil walked to their favorite cafe near the community center. It had become a weekly tradition, a chance to catch up and reflect on the changes in their lives. "I got a call yesterday," Emil said, as they settled at their usual table. "From the Phoenix Symphony. They want me to perform as a guest soloist next month." Derek felt a surge of pride. "Emil, that's amazing. What did you tell them?" "I said yes, but with conditions. I want to perform the piece I wrote for the benefit concert, and I want Marcus and some of my other students to join me. On stage, not performing, just present, to show that music belongs to everyone, not just people who can afford conservatory training." Derek smiled. This was exactly the kind of integration of old life and new life that Emil had been working toward, honoring his professional gifts while staying connected to the work that had given him purpose. "There's something else," Emil continued. "I've been working on a larger composition, a piece about second chances, about the way broken things can be made beautiful again. I want to debut it at the symphony performance." "What are you calling it?" Emil twisted his wedding ring, a gesture that had evolved from nervous habit to conscious remembrance. "Second chances, a dialogue between loss and hope." Derek understood that Emil would always carry Sarah with him, but the weight of that carrying had transformed from burden to blessing. The guilt that had driven him to the streets had been replaced by a commitment to honor both his loss and his survival. "I have news too," Derek said. "Linda and I had dinner last week. We're not getting back together, but we're learning to be friends again. Turns out, when you stop being bitter about the past, you can actually appreciate what was good about it." Emil nodded. "That's one of the hardest lessons, learning to hold gratitude and grief at the same time." As they sat in the afternoon sunshine, Derek reflected on the journey that had brought them both to this moment. A routine police call about a homeless complaint had become a story of redemption that had transformed not just Emil's life, but Derek's as well, and rippled out to affect everyone who'd witnessed Emil's return to music. The street piano where they'd first met was gone now, replaced by a small memorial garden. But the community center had installed a new piano in its lobby, with a plaque that read, "Music belongs to everyone," in memory of Sarah Novak, in celebration of second chances. Sometimes Derek would catch Emil playing that lobby piano before classes, working out new melodies, or simply enjoying the feel of keys beneath his fingers. The music always sounded like hope, complex, hard-won hope that acknowledged pain while refusing to be defeated by it. Derek finished his coffee and prepared to return to work, knowing that Emil would spend the rest of the afternoon teaching teenagers that their voices mattered, that their stories deserved to be heard, and that music could transform even the most broken hearts into something beautiful. It had taken a homeless man and a burned-out cop to teach an entire community that everyone has a song worth hearing. Sometimes the most profound music emerges, not from concert halls, but from the courage to keep playing despite everything that would make you want to stop.